It is dawn in Cadiz. The year is 1587. The smell of raw wood fills the air, pine, oak, salt spray. A woman named Maria stands in the shipyard, her hands already bleeding. Around her, hundreds like her move between timber and nail, between rope and tar. The sound is relentless. The thud of hammers, the scrape of saws, the quiet splash of water against the dock. In her hands, she holds a nail the length of her finger. This nail will become part of a ship. That ship will carry men to war. But Maria will not go. No one here will. They are building the vessels that will leave without them. Above her, the Spanish flag snaps in the wind, a symbol of power that will not protect her from what comes after. Before this day ends, you will understand why these women's names were never written in the histories that followed. You will see how a nation's ambition consumed the hands that built it, then erased the hands that rebuilt nothing. Now, let us begin at the beginning. Spain in 1587 was not yet in decline, though the seeds were planted. The empire was vast. The treasury, however, was not. King Philip II had inherited the greatest naval power in the world, but maintaining it required something no amount of gold could guarantee: bodies. Specifically, it required women. Not as soldiers, Spain did not expect women to die for the empire in battle. It required them in a different way, one that was more efficient and less costly. It required their labor. The Spanish shipyards were suffering from a simple problem. There were not enough men. The men were already soldiers, already sailors, already claimed by the crown for other purposes. So the authorities looked elsewhere. They looked down. They looked to the women who lived in port cities, who had families to feed, who were vulnerable to pressure in ways that made resistance difficult. The Crown did not issue an official decree stating that women must build ships. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it used the language of opportunity. Shipyard owners, many of them enriched by royal contracts, began hiring women at wages that were a fraction of what men earned. It was presented as work. It was survival. For women like Maria, it was obligation dressed in the language of choice. By 1587, the plan for the Great Armada was public knowledge, at least among the nobility. Over 130 ships would be built or refitted. The construction would take place across Spanish ports: Cadiz, Seville, Lisbon, and others. The official story was one of military necessity. England's privateers had struck Spanish colonies. Queen Elizabeth supported these raids. Spain had to respond. The Armada would be Spain's answer. What was not publicly discussed was the scale of mobilization required. Each ship needed timber that had to be felled, stripped, shaped, and fitted. Each ship needed rope in lengths that seemed endless. Each ship needed tar, caulking, nails, countless nails. Each nail had to be hammered by someone's hand. That someone was increasingly female. The shipyards transformed almost overnight. In Cadiz, the pace of construction accelerated to a fever pitch. In Seville, along the Guadalquivir River, women who had never worked construction found themselves recruited into labor they had never imagined. In Lisbon, recently conquered and incorporated into the Spanish Empire, Portuguese women and Spanish migrants were drawn into the work through a combination of economic desperation and administrative pressure. The Crown issued no formal conscription orders for women. It did not need to. Economic circumstances did the work for it. By 1588, the shipyard workforce had transformed completely. Women made up a significant portion of the workers in rope making, sail mending, caulking, and timber preparation. They worked alongside men, but not as equals. They were paid half, sometimes a third, of what male workers received for identical labor. The justification was simple. They had no dependents, or so the logic went. The logic ignored reality. Many of these women were widows. Many had children. Many were the sole earners for their families. Some had lost fathers or brothers to earlier wars. The state's wars had already taken from them, and now the state was taking again. The work itself was brutal. Caulking required crawling inside the narrow hulls of ships, pounding tar-soaked fiber between wooden planks. In summer, the heat inside the hull became unbearable. Women fainted. Some did not recover. The shipyard owners did not record these incidents. There was work to be done, and replacement workers were easy to find. A woman's unconsciousness did not halt production. Another woman would take her place the next day, and the work would continue. If you're drawn to histories of power, erasure, and the mechanisms of control, the stories of those who built empires but were erased from them, consider subscribing. We examine the hidden archives, the fragmentary evidence, the traces of lives that history tried to forget. The rhythms of preparation transformed the ports. What had been seasonal work became constant. Ships that would normally take months to build were rushed. The Crown's desperation was visible in the pace. Women who had worked part-time in sail-making now found themselves working 6 days a week. Some worked 7. The nominal wages they had agreed to were reduced through various mechanisms. Fines for arriving late, deductions for materials, charges for using tools. This pattern was not accidental, it was systematized. In Cadiz, shipyard officials maintained ledgers recording minute infractions. A woman arrived 1 hour late, fine. A woman spoke during work hours, fine. A woman requested a rest day, marked as absence without permission. These fines were deducted from wages before payment. What had been promised as a full day's wage became something less. A woman named Francisca, who worked in sail-making, calculated that by the year's end, the fines had consumed nearly 3 months of wages. She had worked approximately 300 days, but been paid for 250. When she questioned the accounting, she was told that the rates were fixed and the fines were written in her contract. She had agreed to them. The logic was circular and absolute. This is where the mechanism of control became clear. It was not simply about labor extraction. It was about dependency. By reducing what women earned, the system ensured they could not save. By making the work constant, the machinery of production ensured they could not seek other opportunities. By keeping wages low and fines high, the entire apparatus created a state of perpetual financial crisis for every woman who worked there. They could not afford to refuse the next demand, could not afford to resist, could not afford the luxury of complaint. The church reinforced this message. Sermons spoke of sacrifice. A woman who labored in the shipyard was serving God in Spain. Her suffering was not suffering, it was contribution. The nobility spoke of this work as an honor. Being selected to help build the fleet was presented as a privilege. Many women came to internalize this language. They spoke of their bleeding hands as service. They spoke of their exhaustion as devotion. The psychological effect was as precise as the wage reductions. By convincing women that their own destruction was virtuous, the system transformed resistance into sine. But there were also moments of resistance that were never officially recorded. Women whispered in the rope yards. They passed messages about wages at other ports. Some left, seeking work elsewhere. Others negotiated, in small ways, for better conditions. These negotiations were not grand or organized. They were the quiet persistence of people trying to survive. A woman named Isabel requested higher wages because she had lost her husband 3 years prior and now supported her mother and 2 children. She was told that the rate was fixed and could not be altered. When she refused to work, she was blacklisted from all shipyards in the region. Within a month, unable to find work, she sold her mother's property to buy bread. This story was not written in official reports. It exists only in marginal notes in the account books of shipyard owners, preserved in archives in Seville. The accountant had written a brief notation. Isabel Garcia, rope maker, dismissed for insubordination. Reason? Wage negotiation. Do not rehire. Another woman, Catalina, worked for 43 consecutive days without a rest day. When she collapsed during her shift, covered in tar and blood, she was carried to the infirmary, not out of mercy, but to prevent panic among the other workers. She was there for 2 days. On the third day, recovered only partially, she was expected to return to work. When she did not appear, her name was struck from the payroll. There was no official record of what had happened to her. She had simply ceased to exist in the ledgers. Later records, discovered in property transactions from 1589, suggest she had married a merchant to escape the shipyards. But her name never appeared again in the official documents. That single line about Isabel represents thousands. The notation exists because the accountant happened to be meticulous. Most such dismissals were not even recorded. Women simply disappeared from the payrolls and were replaced. The vast majority left no trace at all, not in ledgers, not in letters, not in memories. They moved through history in a kind of shadow, visible only in the gaps where their names should have been. As 1588 arrived, the fleet was nearly complete. By May, the Great Armada set sail from Lisbon. 130 ships, approximately 30,000 men. The ships had been built by the hands of women who would never see them float away from the docks. Maria watched from the shipyard as the vessels she had helped construct disappeared over the horizon. There was, according to one account written decades later by a sympathetic chronicler, a moment when the women fell silent. All the hammering had stopped. The work was done. And they understood, finally, that they had never been part of the story they had just finished building. The Armada carried provisions built on these women's labor, sails sewn by their fingers, hulls caulked by their bloodied hands, and it sailed toward a disaster no one yet knew was coming. The English fleet defeated it. The Spanish ships were scattered by storms off the coast of Ireland and Scotland. Fewer than half returned. It was a catastrophe. Approximately 15,000 men died through battle, shipwreck, disease, and starvation. The defeat shattered Spain's sense of invulnerability. It would not recover its naval dominance for generations. Maria heard the news in late summer. A man came to the shipyard with word that the Armada had been defeated. The Spanish fleet was gone. There would be no more contracts. There would be no more work. The other women heard it too. Some wept. Some said nothing. Maria stood at the dock where she had been working, looking at the timber scattered across the ground, wood that had been destined for ships that would never sail. She was 34 years old. Her hands were permanently scarred from the work. She had spent 14 months building vessels that no longer existed. But the disaster that came after was not primarily about military strategy. For the women left behind, the disaster was structural and immediate. The shipyards that had employed them began to contract. The Crown stopped placing orders for massive fleet construction. The work that had been constant suddenly became scarce. But the women had already been drained by months of intensive labor. Many were in their 30s and 40s by the time the Armada sailed. Their hands were damaged, scarred, weakened, prone to infection. The kind of damage that makes fine work difficult. Widows suddenly found themselves without income. Women who had supported families on shipyard wages now had nothing. The church had praised their service. Now the church had no obligation to them. The state that had mobilized their labor now moved on to other concerns. This is the moment where the historical record becomes almost completely silent. There is no official accounting of what happened to these women. There are no decrees addressing their situation. There are no monuments or records of commemoration. What remains are fragments. A petition, discovered in the archives of Cadiz, signed by approximately 60 women who had worked in the shipyards. The petition, dated 1590, requested pension payments or continued work. The response, written by a royal official, was terse. The extraordinary labor during the time of mobilization was understood to be temporary. No continuing obligation is recognized. The signatories are advised to seek alternative employment or seek support from their families. Many of the women who signed that petition were not capable of alternative employment. Their bodies were damaged. Their skills were specific to shipyard work. Their families had no resources to support them. The widows, those who had lost husbands to the Armada disaster or to the years of preparation, faced an even more complex situation. In Spain's legal and religious framework, widows occupied a peculiar position. They had certain protections under law, but only if they had family money or religious connections. Poor widows had neither. For women who had relied on their husband's wages or their own shipyard income, the loss was compounded. Some widows attempted to remarry quickly, understanding that a husband, any husband, was a form of insurance against destitution. The marriage market, however, was unforgiving. A widow with children from a previous marriage was undesirable. Her body was already known to have borne children. She could not offer the promise of youth or fertility. Some widows did marry, but often to men of much lower status or significant age, men who would not have been available as partners before their financial decline became absolute. One widow named Leonor had lost her husband at sea. He was not killed in battle, but died of disease aboard one of the returning ships. She had 2 children under 12. She had worked in the shipyards and earned wages during the construction period. After the Armada sailed, she had no income. The meager pension she was promised by the crown was never provided. She spent 2 years attempting to find alternative work. She took in laundry. She worked as a servant in a merchant's house for a wage so small that it barely covered her rent. In 1590, desperate and depleted, she entered a convent. Her children were placed with her sister, who resented the burden but could not refuse. Leonor's name appears once more in the records, in the convent ledger, marked as arriving of reduced circumstance with melancholy disposition. Others simply vanished from the records. They moved into households as servants, or relatives took them in, or they became invisible in ways that left no trace. Some sold what little property they possessed: small houses, jewelry inherited from mothers, land that had been in the family for generations. Property records from Cadiz and Seville show unusual sales transactions in 1589 and 1590, often involving widows selling to merchants at prices far below market value. These women needed cash immediately. They had no time to negotiate or wait for better offers. The records document the transaction, but not the desperation that created it. The historical silence is almost complete. Here is the mechanism that becomes clear when you study this period. Power had mobilized women's labor under a promise, implicit rather than explicit, that this was temporary, extraordinary, and ultimately in service of something greater. The women had internalized this language. They had called their bleeding hands sacrifice. When the extraordinary moment ended, power simply revoked the unspoken contract. There was no payment for sustained injury. There was no recognition of what had been given. This is not unique to Spain. It is a pattern that would repeat across centuries and across nations. Mobilize women's labor during crisis. Define it as temporary. Withdraw support when the crisis ends. Erase the record of their contribution. The historical documentation of the Spanish Armada is enormous. Thousands of pages detail the ships, the routes, the battles, the winds, the strategic errors. Libraries contain books about the men who sailed and the men who planned it. The military histories are comprehensive and detailed. The women who built the ships appear in almost none of these histories. When they do appear, it is in passing. A single sentence noting that local workers, including women, were employed in shipyard labor. The sentence exists as an afterthought. The women who spent months of their lives in those yards, whose health was damaged by the work, whose economic survival was destroyed by its sudden cessation, are reduced to a parenthetical reality. This is how erasure works. It is not always violent. Sometimes it is simply the absence of a name, the omission of a story, the silence where a record should have been. Yet evidence remains, scattered and fragmentary. In the ledgers preserved in Spanish archives, there are discrepancies. Shipyard accounts show payment for work that cannot be assigned to named male workers. The amounts are too small for skilled positions. The timing aligns with known construction schedules. When historians have bothered to look closely, they can extract these payments from the records and reconstruct, partially, what happened. In one Cadiz account book from 1588, there is an entry: payments for rope work, persons unnamed, May through August. Total disbursement, 340 reales. That amount, if divided by the number of hours recorded as worked, yields a wage rate that is precisely half of what male rope workers earned. No names are attached, no occupations listed. But the precision of the calculation, exactly half, suggests intention. The omission was deliberate. There are also the marginal notes. The accountant's notation about Isabel Garcia is one example. There are others: dismissals noted, wage disputes recorded, women's names appearing and disappearing from payrolls in patterns that suggest organized dismissal. In the margins of another ledger, someone has written, Francisca, refused work assignment, marked as insubordinate, wages withheld from month of July, do not rehire. Below it, in different handwriting, paid on anyway, priest intercession. The priest's intervention saved her wages, at least, but her name never appears again. There is a petition, already mentioned. There are convent records showing an unusual influx of new members in the years immediately following the Armada. More women entering than is typical for peacetime, with an unusually high concentration of new members aged 30 to 50, suggesting they were former workers rather than daughters or widows from the traditional entry pool. There are property records showing the sale of women's possessions, houses, jewelry, land, to cover basic living expenses in the years after 1588. In one property transfer, a woman named Constanza sold a small house to a merchant. The official notation states the price, 180 reales, approximately what she would have earned in 5 months of steady shipyard work. No buyer would have paid so little in normal circumstances. But Constanza needed cash on a Tuesday in November 1589. The market does not care why. These fragments do not form a complete picture, but they form enough of one to understand that something systematic happened, something that left damage, something that was deliberately forgotten, and something that, despite the efforts to erase it, continues to whisper from the margins of history. The question that echoes from 1588 into the present is this: how many times have we mobilized the labor of the vulnerable during crisis, extracted what we needed, and then erased the record of what we took from them? How many times have we called this necessity? How many times have we called this service? And how many times have we discovered too late that the pattern was not inevitable, but chosen? The women who built the Spanish Armada did not choose to be forgotten. The state chose it for them. The choice was made not with a decree, but with silence, with the decision not to write their names, not to record their wages, not to acknowledge what happened after the ships sailed away. Today, the Spanish Armada exists in history as a moment when Spain's power was tested and found wanting. It exists as a military catastrophe. But in the historical record, the real disaster, the abandonment of the women who had been mobilized for war, is almost completely absent. This is not an accident of history. This is history as it was constructed. In archives across Spain, if you know where to look, the evidence still exists. The fragmentary wages, the marginal notes, the convent registries, the property sales, the single petition for pension payments that was denied. These do not form an official record. They form something else. They form the trace of what was deliberately unmade. When we read the histories of the Armada, the comprehensive, detailed, well-researched histories, we are reading the story that was chosen to be preserved. We are reading the story of ships and sailors and storms and military strategy. We are not reading the story of the women whose hands built those ships, whose bodies were damaged in the building, whose survival became precarious after the ships sailed. The absence of that story is not natural. It was created. It was maintained. It continues to be maintained in every history book that describes the Armada without mentioning the women who constructed it. The most uncomfortable question is not about the past. It is about the present. It is about asking, what are we mobilizing the labor of the vulnerable for now? What are we calling necessity? What are we calling service? And what records are we failing to make? What names are we failing to write? What damage are we failing to acknowledge? The pattern did not die in 1588. It did not die in Spain. It persists wherever crisis is used as justification for extracting labor from those with the least power to refuse, and where the extraction is followed by abandonment and erasure. The women of the Spanish shipyards were forgotten not because their story was unimportant. They were forgotten because it was important enough that it needed to be hidden.